Hello, welcome back to another section of The General in His Labyrinth by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Hope that you're doing well wherever you are. It is a very chilly day here in New York, so I've got my blanket that I'm cuddling up with while we read this section. I'm recording on a Sunday, so hopefully the traffic noise will be a little less people on the road on the weekend. But anyway, we are starting on page 101, I believe. Yes, 101, and it's with a fresh new chapter. Look at that, chapter 4. If you are following along in a different sort of copy, we're starting right at the beginning of what is technically chapter 4. So that is awesome. We are gonna get pretty close to halfway with this section, so that is exciting. Oh, the traffic. I hope it calms down after the intro here. But yeah, if you're liking this book, give me a thumb so I know what kind of books you like. If you want any books read in the future, leave them down in the comments. I will try my best to find a copy at the library and put it into the schedule. I have a few books that people have recommended so far or requested so far, so gonna try to have those up on the docket for you coming up. But anyway, and subscribe if you want to catch the rest of the book. But anyway, today we're starting page 101, chapter 4. Let's get into it. A gunboat moored in port began to move as soon as it was informed that a flotilla of barges was approaching. Jose Palacios sighted it through the tent windows, and he leaned over the hammock where the general was lying with his eyes closed. "Sir," he said, we're in Mompox." "God's country," said the general without opening his eyes. As they sailed down to the coast, the river had grown more vast and solemn, like a swamp with no beginning or end, and the heat was so dense you could touch it with your hands. Without bitterness, the general gave up the sudden dawns and piercing twilights that had kept him in the stern of the barge for the first few days, and he yielded to dejection. He did not dictate letters, or read, or ask his companions any question that might reveal a certain interest in life. Even during the hottest siestas, he covered himself with the blanket and stayed in the hammock with his eyes closed. Thinking he had not heard him, Jose Palacios repeated the message, and again the general responded without opening his eyes. "Mompox doesn't exist," he said. "Sometimes we dream about it, but it doesn't exist." "At least I can testify to the existence of the Santa Barbara Tower," said Jose Palacios. "I see it from here." The general opened his tormented eyes, sat up in the hammock, and in the aluminum light of noon saw the first roofs of the very ancient and long-suffering city of Mompox that had been devastated by war, debased by the turmoil of the Republic, decimated by smallpox. This was the time when the river had begun to change course with an irreparable disdain that would become total abandonment by the end of the century. All that remained of the masonry dike that the colonial governors, with peninsular obstinacy, had hastened to rebuild each time it was destroyed by flood, was rubble scattered along a beach of fallen stones. The warship approached the barges, and a black officer who still wore the uniform of the old viceregal police aimed a cannon at them. Captain Casildo Santos managed to shout, "Hey, black man, don't be an idiot!" The oarsmen stopped rowing, and the barges were left to the mercy of the current. The grenadiers waited for orders, raising their rifles, and took aim at the gunboat. The officer was unperturbed. "Passports," he shouted, "in the name of the law." Only then did he see the soul in torment who emerged from under the canvas, the exhausted hand that still held inexorable authority, ordering the soldiers to lower their weapons. Then he said to the officer in a faint voice, "Although you may not believe it, Captain, I have no passport." The officer did not know who he was, but when Fernando told him, he leaped into the water with his weapons and ran down the riverbank to inform everyone of the good news. The gunboat, its bell clanging, escorted the barges into port. Even before the entire city came into view at the last bend in the river, the bells of its 8 churches were ringing out the tidings. During the colonial period, Santa Cruz de Mompox had been the commercial bridge between the Caribbean coast and the interior of the country, and this had been the origin of its wealth. When the windstorms of liberty began to blow, that stronghold of the American aristocracy was the first to proclaim independence. Reconquered by Spain, it was liberated again by the general himself. It consisted of only 3 wide, straight, and dusty streets running parallel to the river, with large windowed 1-story houses where 2 counts and 3 marquises prospered. The fame of its craftsmanship in precious metals had survived the vicissitudes of the Republic. On this occasion, the general arrived so disillusioned with his glory and so disenchanted with the world that he was caught off guard by the crowd waiting for him in port. He threw on his velveteen trousers and high boots, wrapped himself in the blanket despite the heat, and changed his nightcap for the broad-brimmed hat he had used in Honda for waving farewell. The funeral of a high dignitary was taking place in the church of La Concepcion. In attendance at the solemn mass were all the civil ecclesiastical authorities, the congregations and schools, and the leading citizens in their finest crape, and the clamor of the bells made them lose their composure because they thought it was a fire alarm. But the same bailiff who had entered in great agitation and whispered the news into the mayor's ear shouted for everyone to hear, "The president is in the port!" For many still did not know he was no longer president. On Monday, a mail carrier had spread the rumors from Honda among the towns along the river, but had clarified nothing, and so the ambiguity made the unexpected reception more effusive, and even the bereaved family understood that most of the mourners would leave the church to gather at the ruined wall. The funeral ended before it was over, and only an intimate group accompanied the coffin to the cemetery in the midst of thundering rockets and bells. The river was still low because of May's light rainfall, and as a consequence, the general and his entourage had to scale cliffs of stone debris to reach the port. With bad grace, the general refused someone's offer to carry him, and he climbed, leaning on Captain Ibarra's arm, staggering at each step and struggling to hold himself upright, but with his dignity intact. He greeted the authorities in the port with energetic handshakes and of incredible vigor, given the condition of his body and the smallness of his hands. Those who had seen him the last time he was there could not believe their memories. He seemed as old as his own father, but the little breath he had was enough to keep anyone from making special arrangements for him. He refused the platforms carried in Good Friday processions which they had prepared for him, and he said he would walk to the church of La Concepcion. In the end, he had to ride the mayor's mule that the official had saddled in great haste when he saw him disembark in so weakened a state. Jose Palacios had noticed many faces in Port Tiger with the red embers of smallpox, a stubborn illness endemic to the towns of the lower Magdalena. The patriots had come to fear it more than they feared the Spaniards after it decimated the liberating troops during the river campaign. Then, when the smallpox persisted, the general arranged for a visiting French naturalist to stay long enough to inoculate the people with the serious fluid that oozed from the smallpox of cattle. But this method of treatment caused so many deaths that, in the end, no one wanted to hear anything more about the cow cure, as they called it, and many mothers preferred that their children be exposed to the risks of contagion rather than the dangers of prevention. Sound familiar? Nevertheless, official reports received by the general led him to believe that the scourge of smallpox was being conquered. And therefore, when Jose Palacios pointed out to him the number of marked faces in the crowd, his reaction was not so much surprise as weary disgust. "It will always be like this," he said. as long as subordinate lie to make us happy. He did not allow those who welcomed him in port to see his bitterness. He gave them a summary accounting of the events of his renunciation and the disorder that reigned in Santa Fe de Bogota, exhorting them to give their unanimous support to the new government. There is no other alternative, he said, either unity or anarchy. He said he was going and would not return, not so much to seek relief for the evident afflictions of his body, which were numerous and very grave, as to attempt to find respite from the untold sorrow that other people's suffering caused him. But he did not say when he was going, or where, and he repeated without real relevance that he had not yet received from the government the passport that would allow him to leave the country. He thanked them for the 20 years of glory that Mompox had bestowed upon him, and begged them not to honor him with any title except citizen. The church of La Concepcion was still draped in mourning, and the breath of funeral flowers and candles still floated through the air when the crowd trooped in for an improvised Te Deum. Jose Palacios, sitting with the rest of the entourage, realized that the general could find no comfort in his pew. Yet the mayor, an immutable mestizo with a handsome leonine head, stayed next to him inside a closed circle. Fernanda, the widow Benjumea, whose American beauty had created havoc at the court in Madrid, lent the general her sandalwood fan to help him defend himself against the stupefying ceremony. He moved it back and forth without hope, not even for the consolation of its little gusts of air, until the heat began to interfere with his breathing. Then he whispered in the mayor's ear, "Believe me, I don't deserve this punishment." "The love of the people has its price, Excellency," said the mayor. "Sad to say, this isn't love, it's curiosity," he said. When the Te Deum was over, he said goodbye to the widow Benjumea with a bow and returned her fan. She attempted to give it back to him. "Do me the honor of keeping it as a remembrance of one who loves you well," she said to him. "The sad thing, Signora, is that I do not have much time left for remembering," he said. The priest insisted on protecting him from the suffocating heat with the Holy Week canopy as they walked from the church of La Concepcion to the Academy of San Pedro Apostol, a two-story mansion with a monastic cloister of ferns and pinks and a luminous orchard of fruit trees in the rear. The arcaded corridors were not habitable during those months because of unhealthy winds that blew in from the river even at night, but the rooms adjoining the large parlor were protected by thick masonry walls that kept them in autumnal shadow. Jose Palacios had gone ahead to have everything ready. The bedroom, its rough walls covered by a fresh coat of whitewash, was dimly lit by a single green-shuttered window that looked out on the orchard. He had the position of the bed changed so that the window facing the orchard would be at the foot and not at the head of the bed, and this way the general could see the yellow guavas on the trees and enjoy their perfume. The general arrived on Fernando's arm and in the company of the priest from the church of La Concepcion, who was also the rector of the academy. As soon as he walked through the door, he leaned his back against the wall, surprised by the scent of the guavas lying in a gourd on the windowsill, their luxuriant fragrance saturating the entire bedroom. He stood with his eyes closed, inhaling the heartbreaking aroma of days gone by until he lost his breath. Then he scrutinized the room with meticulous attention, as if each object were a revelation. In addition to the canopied bed, there was a mahogany chest of drawers, a marble-topped night table, also of mahogany, and an easy chair covered in red velvet. On the wall beside the window was an octagonal clock with Roman numerals, which had stopped at 7 minutes past 1. "At last, something's still the same," said the general. The priest was surprised. "Excuse me, Your Excellency, but as far as I know, You've never been here before." Jose Palacios was also surprised, for they had never visited this house, but the general persisted in his recollections, with so many accurate references that he left everyone perplexed. In the end, however, he attempted to reassure them with his habitual irony. "Perhaps it was during a previous incarnation," he said. "After all, anything is possible in a city where we've just seen an excommunicated man walking under a canopy." A short while later, a thunderstorm broke that left the city shipwrecked. The general took advantage of it to recover from his reception, enjoying the scent of the guavas in the shadowy room, while he pretended to sleep on his back with all his clothes on, and then, in fact, did fall asleep, in the recuperative silence following the deluge. Jose Palacios knew this was true when he heard him speaking with the good diction and sharp timbre of his youth, which by this time he regained only in sleep. He talked of Caracas, a city in ruins that was no longer his, its walls papered with attacks against him, and its streets overflowing with a torrent of human shit. In a corner of the room, almost invisible in the easy chair, Jose Palacios watched to make certain that no one outside the entourage could hear the secrets of his sleep. Through the half-opened door, he signaled to Colonel Wilson, who sent away the soldiers of the guard wandering through the garden. "Nobody wants us here, and in Caracas nobody obeys us," said the sleeping general. "It all evens out." He continued with the psaltery of bitter laments, remnants of a ruined glory that the wind of death was carrying away in tatters. After almost an hour of delirium, noises in the corridor and the metal of an arrogant voice awoke him. He snorted abruptly and spoke in his faded, waking voice without opening his eyes. "What the hell's going on?" What was going on was that General Lorenzo Carcamo, a veteran of the wars of emancipation with a thorny disposition and an almost demented personal courage, was trying to force his way into the bedroom before the hour scheduled for interviews. He had pushed Colonel Wilson aside after hitting a lieutenant of the grenadiers with his saber, and he had bowed only to the otherworldly power of the priest, who led him, unprotesting, to an adjacent office. The general, informed by Wilson, shouted in indignation, "Tell Carcamo I died. That's all. Just tell him I died." Colonel Wilson went to the office to confront the obstreperous soldier, who was dressed for the occasion in his parade uniform and a constellation of combat medals. But by then his arrogance had collapsed and his eyes were flooded with tears. "No, Wilson, don't give me the message," he said. "I've already heard it." When the general opened his eyes, he realized the clock still read 7 minutes past 1. Jose Palacios wound it, said it from memory, and then confirmed the time on his 2 watches. A little later, Fernanda Barriga came in and tried to have the general eat some vegetable stew. He resisted, although he had not eaten anything since the previous day, but he ordered the food brought to the office so that he could eat during the interviews. In the meantime, he succumbed to temptation and picked up one of the many guavas in the gourd. He was intoxicated by its aroma for a moment, gave it a greedy bite, chewed the flesh with childish delight, tasted the fruit on all sides, and swallowed it, little by little, with a long sigh of memory. Then he sat on the hammock with the gourd of guavas between his legs, and he ate them all, one after the other, almost not taking the time to breathe. Jose Palacios took him by surprise when there was only one left. "We'll kill ourselves." The general mimicked him with good humor. "No deader than we are already." At 3:30 sharp, the prearranged hour, he gave orders for the visitors to begin to come into the office in twos, for in this way he could finish with one in the shortest time by letting him see his haste to attend to the other. Dr. Nicasio de Val, who was among the first, found him sitting with his back to a glass-paned window, through which one could see the entire farm and beyond that the steaming swamps. In his hand he held the plate of vegetable stew that Fernando Barriga had brought him, and that he did not even taste because he was already beginning to feel the effects of his overindulgence in the guavas. Dr. Del Val later summarized his impression of the interview in unadorned language. That man's goose was cooked. Everyone who came for an interview agreed, each in his own way. Nevertheless, even those most touched by his weakness lacked compassion, for they urged him to travel to neighboring villages to be godfather to children, or to inaugurate public works, or to see for himself the poverty in which people lived because of the government's negligence. After an hour, the nausea and stomach cramps caused by the guavas became alarming, and he had to call a halt to the interviews despite his desire to accommodate everyone who had been waiting since the morning. There was no room in the patio for more calves, goats, chickens, or the different kinds of wild game that had been brought as gifts. The grenadiers had to intervene to prevent a disturbance, but by dusk the situation had returned to normal thanks to a second providential downpour which cleared the air and enhanced the silence. Despite the general's explicit refusal, a dinner in his honor had been prepared for 4 o'clock at a nearby house. But it was held without him, for the carminative power of the guavas kept him in a state of emergency until after 11 o'clock that night. He stayed in the hammock, prostrate with torturous shooting pains and fragrant farts, feeling his soul slip away in abrasive waters. The priest brought a medicine prepared by the pharmacist at the academy. The general refused it. "If I lost power with one emetic, Old Nick will carry me away with a second," he said. He abandoned himself to his fate, shivering with the icy sweat in his bones, his only consolation the occasional snatches of beautiful string music wafting in from the banquet held without him. Little by little, the flood from his belly subsided, the pain passed, the music ended, and he remained floating in nothingness. His previous visit to Mompox had almost been the last. He was returning from Caracas after effecting, through the magic of his person, an emergency reconciliation with General Jose Antonio Paez, who was nevertheless very far from announcing his separatist dream. At that time, his enmity with Santander was public knowledge, and had gone to the extreme of the general's refusing receiving any more of his letters because he no longer trusted either his heart or his morality. "Save yourself the trouble of calling yourself my friend," he wrote to him. The immediate pretext for Santanderist animosity was a hurried proclamation the general had made to the people of the city, in which he said, without thinking too much about it, that all his actions had been guided by the liberty and glory of Caracas. On his return to New Granada, he had tried to smooth things over with an appropriate phrase for Cartagena and Mompox. "If Caracas gave me life, you gave me glory." But it looked too much like rhetorical fence-mending to placate the demagoguery of the Santanderists. In an attempt to hold off the final disaster, the general was returning to Santa Fe de Bogota with a column of troops, hoping to gather others along the way, in order to begin once again the struggle for national integrity. He had said then that this was his decisive moment, which is just what he had said when he marched off to prevent the separation of Venezuela. A little more reflection would have permitted him to realize that for almost 20 years, no moment of his life had not been decisive. "The entire church, the entire army, the immense majority of the nation were on my side," he would write later, remembering those days. But despite all these advantages, he said, it had been proved over and over again that when he abandoned the south to march north, and vice versa, the country he left behind was lost, devastated by new civil wars. It was his destiny. The Santanderist press missed no opportunity to attribute military defeats to his nocturnal excesses. Among the many other lies intended to diminish his glory, at that time they published the story in Santa Fe de Bogota that not he but General Santander had been in command at the Battle of Boyacá, where independence had been assured at 7 o'clock in the morning of August 7th, 1819, while he was pleasuring himself in Tunja with a lady of dubious reputation in viceregal society. In any case, it was not just the Santanderist press that evoked his libertine knights in order to discredit him. Even before the final victory, it was said that at least 3 battles in the wars for independence had been lost only because he was not where he was supposed to be, but in some woman's bed instead. During another of his visits to Mompox, a caravan of women of diverse ages and colors came down to the second of the 3 streets and left the air heavy with cheap perfume. They rode side-saddle, carried parasols of printed satin, and wore dresses of exquisite silks, the likes of which had never been seen in the city. No one denied the speculation that they were the general's concubines, traveling ahead of him. A false speculation, like so many others, for his wartime harems were one of the many salon fabrications that pursued him beyond the grave. There was nothing new in these methods of slanted reporting. The general himself had used them during the war against Spain when he ordered Santander to print false news items in order to deceive the Spanish commanders. And therefore, when the Republic was already established and he criticized this same Santander for his misuse of the press, he responded with exquisite sarcasm. "We had a good teacher, Excellency." "A bad teacher," the general replied, "for you must remember that the news we invented was turned against us." He was so sensitive to everything said about him, true or false, that he never recovered from any falsehood, and until the moment of his death he struggled to disprove them. Nevertheless, he did little to protect himself from lies. As he had on other occasions, the last time he was in Mompox, he gambled his glory for the sake of a woman. She was Josefa Sagrario, a high-born Mompoxina who, disguised in a Franciscan habit, made her way past 7 guard stations using the password given to her by Jose Palacios. God's country. She was so white that her dazzling body made her visible in the darkness. That night, moreover, she had succeeded in surpassing the miracle of her beauty with that of her ornamentation, for over the front and the back of her dress she had hung a cuirass of magnificent local goldwork. And when he tried to carry her to the hammock, he could scarcely lift her because of the weight of the gold. At dawn, after a night of abandon, she felt the terror of transience and begged him to stay another night. It was an enormous risk, since according to the general's secret agents, Santander had organized a conspiracy to strip him of his power and dismember Colombia. But he stayed, and not just one night. He stayed 10, and they were so happy they both came to believe that, in fact, they loved each other more than anyone in this world ever had before. She gave him her gold. "For your wars," she said. He did not use it because of his scruples regarding treasure earned in bed and therefore ill-gotten, and he left it in the keeping of a friend. He forgot it. After the attack caused by the guavas on his final visit to Mompox, the general had the chest opened to verify its contents, and only then did he find the gold along with her name and date in his memory. It was a miraculous vision. Josefa Sagriero's gold cuirass made of different kinds of exquisite metalwork with a total weight of 30 pounds. And there was a case with 23 forks, 24 knives, 24 teaspoons, and small sugar tongs, all of gold as well as other household items of great value, also left behind on different occasions for safekeeping and also forgotten. In the fabulous disorder of the general's treasuries, these discoveries in the most unthought of places no longer surprised anyone. He gave instructions that the flatware should be added to his baggage, and that the trunk full of gold should be returned to its owner. But the priest who was rector of San Pedro Apostol astounded him with the news that Josefa Sagrario and her family were living in exile in Italy for conspiring against the security of the state. "More of Santander's shit, of course," said the general. "No, general," said the priest. "You exiled them yourself, without realizing it, after the troubles in 28. He left the chest of gold where it was while he clarified the matter, and then he did not concern himself any more about her exile, for as he told Jose Palacios, he was certain that Josefa Sagraria would return along with the horde of his proscribed enemies as soon as he lost sight of the Cartagena coastline. "Cassandro must be packing his trunks by now," he said. And in fact, many exiles began their own repatriation as soon as they learned he was on his way to Europe. But General Santander, a man of sober reflections and unfathomable decisions, was one of the last. The news of the renunciation put him on the alert, but he gave no signs of returning, and he did not hasten to conclude the avid study trips through the countries of Europe that he had undertaken as soon as he disembarked in Hamburg in October of the previous year. On March 2nd, 1831, when he was in Florence, he read in the Journal du Commerce that the general had died. Nevertheless, he did not begin his slow return until 6 months later, when a new government restored his military ranks and honors, and the Congress elected him President of the Republic in absentia. Before weighing anchor in Mompax, the general made an apologetic visit to Lorenzo Carcamo, his old comrade in arms. Only then did he learn that he was gravely ill, and got up from his bed the previous afternoon only to greet him. Despite the ravages of illness, Carcamo had to make an effort to control the power of his body, and his voice thundered while he used pillows to dry the flood of tears that poured from his eyes without any connection at all to his state of mind. Together, they lamented their misfortunes, mourned the frivolity of nations and the ingratitude of victory, and ranted against Santander, who was always an obligatory topic for them. The general had not often been so explicit. During the campaign of 1813, Lorenzo Carcamo had been witness to a violent altercation between the general and Santander when the latter refused to obey his order to cross the frontier in order to liberate Venezuela a second time. General Carcamo still thought this had been the origin of a deep-seated bitterness that the passage of time did no more than exacerbate. The general, on the other hand, believed this was not the end, but rather the beginning of a great friendship. Nor was it true that the origin of their antagonism lay in the privileges granted to General Paez or the ill-fated constitution of Bolivia, or the imperial investiture the general accepted in Peru, or the lifelong presidency and Senate membership he dreamed of in Colombia, or the absolute powers he assumed after the Ocaña Convention. No. These reasons, and many others like them, had not caused the terrible animosity that grew more bitter with the years until it culminated in the assassination attempt of September 25. The real reason was that Santander could never assimilate the idea that this continent should be a single nation, said the general. The unity of America was too much for him. He looked at Lorenzo Carcamo lying on his bed as if it were the last battlefield of a war that had been doomed from the start, and he ended the visit. "Of course, none of this means anything now that the patient has died," he said. Lorenzo Carcamo watched him stand up, sad and stripped of everything, and he realized that for the general and himself, memories were more of a burden than the years. When he grasped the general's hand between both of his, he also realized that each had a fever, and he wondered which of their deaths would keep them from seeing each other again. "We lost a world, Simon, my old friend," said Lorenzo Carcamo. "They lost it for us," said the general, "and the only thing to do now is start again from the beginning." "And we will," said Lorenzo Carcamo. "Not me," said the general. "All that's left for me is for them to throw me out with the garbage." As a memento, Lorenzo Carcamo gave him a pair of pistols in a beautiful crimson satin case. He knew the general did not like firearms, and that in his few personal quarrels he had trusted to the sword. But these pistols possessed the moral virtue of having once been used with success in a duel for love, and the general accepted them with emotion. A few days later, in Torbaco, the news would reach him that the General Carcamo had died. The signs were auspicious when the voyage was resumed at dusk on May 23rd. Propelled more by favorable currents than by the oarsmen, the barges left behind the slate precipices and the mirages on the wide beaches. The rafts made of tree trunks, which they were seeing now in greater numbers, seemed swifter. Unlike the ones they had observed earlier, these had dreamy little houses with flower pots and clothes hung to dry in the windows, and they carried wire chicken coops, milk cows, and shabby children who continued to wave at the barges long after they had passed. They traveled all night through a flock of stars. At dawn, they sighted the town of Zambrano, brilliant in the early light. Don Castulo Campillo, nicknamed the Kid, was waiting for them under the huge ceiba tree in port, having prepared a coastal sancocho stew at his house in honor of the general. The invitation was inspired by the legend that on his first visit to Zambrano, he had eaten lunch in a poor inn on the rocky hill overlooking the port, and had said that he had to come back once a year, if only for the succulent coastal sancocho. The landlady was so impressed by the importance of her guest that she borrowed dishes and flatware from the distinguished house of the Campillo family. The general did not remember many details of that occasion, and neither he nor Jose Palacios was certain if coastal sancocho was the same as Venezuelan hervido. Nevertheless, General Correño thought it was the same dish, and that they had in fact eaten it on the hill in the port, not during the river campaign, however, but when they were there 3 years earlier on the steamboat. The general, more and more disquieted by the leaks in his memory, accepted Correño's version with humility. The luncheon for the grenadiers was set under the large almond trees in the patio of the Campillo's family seigneurial home, and served on wooden planks covered with plantain leaves instead of tablecloths. On the interior terrace, overlooking the patio, a splendid table was laid with rigorous formality in the English manner for the general, his officers, and a few guests. The lady of the house explained that the news from Mompox had taken them by surprise at 4 o'clock in the morning, and they had just had time to slaughter the fast animal in their herds. There it was, cut into succulent pieces and cooked at a merry boil in great pots, along with all the fruits of the garden. The announcement that they had prepared a banquet for him without first notifying him soured the general's humor, and Jose Palacios had to call on his best arts as conciliator so that he would agree to disembark, but the hospitable atmosphere at the fiesta improved his mood. he had well-deserved praise for the good taste of the house, and for the sweetness of the young girls in the family, who were modest and diligent and served the table of honor with an old-fashioned grace. Above all, he praised the fineness of the china and the quality of the silver, emblazoned with the heraldic emblems of some house brought down by the fatality of modern times, but he ate with his own. The only unpleasantness was caused by a Frenchman who was living under the protection of the Campillo family and who attended the luncheon with an insatiable need to demonstrate before such notable guests his universal knowledge regarding the enigmas of this life and the next. He had lost everything in a shipwreck, and with his entourage of assistants and servants, he had occupied half the house for almost a year while he waited for uncertain assistance that was supposed to come to him from New Orleans. José Palacios learned that his name was Diocles Atlantique, but he could not determine either his field of knowledge or the nature of his mission to New Granada. Naked and with a trident in his hand, he would have been identical to King Neptune, and he had a well-established reputation in the town as a swinish boor. But luncheon with the general moved him to come to the table bathed and with clean fingernails and dressed for the stifling heat of May as if it were the wintry salons of Paris. Dressed for the stifling heat of May as if it were the wintry salons of Paris, wearing a blue jacket with gold buttons and striped trousers in the outdated style of the Directorate. No sooner were the first greetings concluded that he embarked on an encyclopedic lecture in meticulous Spanish. He stated that a classmate of his from the primary school in Grenoble had just deciphered the Egyptian hieroglyphics after 14 sleepless years. That corn did not originate in Mexico, but in a region of Mesopotamia where fossils had been discovered that antedated the arrival of Columbus in the Antilles. That the Assyrians had obtained experimental proof of the influence of celestial bodies on disease. That, contrary to the claims of a recent encyclopedia, the Greeks had possessed no knowledge of cats until 400 BC. While he pontificated without mercy on these and many other matters, he made emergency pauses only to lament the cultural deficiencies of American cuisine. The general sat opposite him and paid him no more than the scant attention civility demanded, pretending to eat more than he really ate and not raising his eyes from the plate. From the start, the Frenchman attempted to speak to him in his own language, and the general responded in kind for the sake of courtesy, but then returned without delay to Spanish. His patience that day surprised José Lourenço Silva, who knew how the absolutism of Europeans exasperated him. Yeah, this French guy sounds like a bag of hot air. Bottom of page 121. The Frenchman addressed the various guests in a loud voice, even those sitting farthest from him, but it was evident he was interested only in the attention of the general. Then, leaping from the rooster to the burro, as he called it, he asked the general a direct question. What would be the one correct system of government suitable to the new republics? Without raising his eyes from the plate, the general asked in turn, "And what is your opinion?" "My opinion is that the example of Bonaparte is a good one, not only for us, but for the entire world," said the Frenchman. "I do not doubt that you think so," said the general without hiding the irony. "Europeans believe that only what Europe invents is good for the entire universe, and anything else is detestable. It had been my understanding that your excellency advocated the monarchist solution." said the Frenchman. The general raised his eyes for the first time. Well, don't let it be your understanding any more, he said. My brow will never be sullied by a crown. He pointed to the group of his aides-de-camp and concluded, I have Iturbide there to remind me. Speaking of which, said the Frenchman, the statement you made when they shot his father, the emperor, gave great encouragement to European monarchists. I would not change a letter of what I said to them, said the general. It amazes me that a man as ordinary as Iturbide could do such extraordinary things, but may God save me from his fate as he has saved me from his actions, although I know he will never save me from the same ingratitude. Then he tried to temper his harshness and explained that the initiative for establishing a monarchical regime in the new republics had come from General Jose Antonio Paez. The idea proliferated, driven by all manner of equivocal interests, and even he had come to think of it, hidden under the cloak of a presidency for life, as a desperate formula for achieving and maintaining the integrity of America at any cost. But he soon realized how senseless it was. With federalism, the opposite occurs, he concluded. It seems too perfect for our countries because it demands virtues and talents far superior to our own. In any case, said the Frenchman, it is not systems but their excesses that dehumanize history. We know that speech by heart, said the general. At bottom, it's the stupidity of Benjamin Constant, the greatest pastry chef in Europe, who was against the revolution, and then for the revolution, who fought against Napoleon, and then was one of his courtiers, who often goes to bed Republican and wakes up monarchist, or vice versa, and who has now established himself as the absolute repository of our truth by the act and grace of European arrogance. Constant's arguments against tyranny are very lucid, said the Frenchman. Senor Constant, like a good Frenchman, is a fanatic for absolute interests, said the general. On the other hand, Abbot Pratt made the only lucid statement in that polemic when he pointed out that policy depends on where and when it is formulated. During the war to the death, I myself gave the order to execute 800 Spanish prisoners in a single day, including the patients in the hospital at La Guaira. Today, under the same circumstances, my voice would not tremble if I gave the order again, and Europeans would not have the moral authority to reproach me, for if any history is drowned in blood, indignity, and injustice, it is the history of Europe. The deeper he delved into his analysis in the great silence that seemed to take possession of the entire town, the more he fed the fire of his own rage. The Frenchman was thunderstruck, and attempted to interrupt, but he cut him off with a wave of his hand. The general evoked the hideous slaughters of European history. On St. Bartholomew's night, the number of slain reached more than 2,000 in 10 hours. During the splendor of the Renaissance, 12,000 mercenaries in the pay of the imperial armies sacked and devastated Rome and cut the throats of 8,000 of its inhabitants. And the apotheosis several things. And the apotheosis, Ivan IV, Tsar of all the Russias, who deserved the name the Terrible, exterminated the entire population of the cities between Moscow and Novgorod, and in Novgorod, in a single assault, massacred all 20,000 inhabitants on the simple suspicion of a conspiracy against him. So, stop doing us the favor of telling us what we should do," he concluded. "Don't attempt to teach us how we should be. Don't attempt to make us just like you. Don't try to have us do well in 20 years what you have done so badly in 2000. He crossed his cutlery on his plate, and for the first time he fixed his flaming eyes on the Frenchman. "Damn it, please let us have our Middle Ages in peace." He was breathless, overcome by another attack of coughing, but when at last he could control it, there was not a vestige of rage left in him. He turned toward Kid Campillo and favored him with his best smile. "Pardon me, my dear friend," he said. "Such ravings were not worthy of so memorable a luncheon." Colonel Wilson related this incident to a chronicler of the time who did not take to the trouble to record it. "The poor general's case is closed," he said. That was the fundamental belief of all who saw him on his final journey, and perhaps that was why no one left a written record. Indeed, in the opinion of some of his companions, the general would have no place in history. The jungle was less dense after Zambrano. The towns became gayer and more colorful, and in some there was music in the streets for no reason at all. The general stretched out in the hammock, trying to digest the Frenchman's impertinence with a peaceful siesta, but it was not easy to do. He could not stop thinking about it. And with José Palacios, he lamented not having found the well-aimed sentences and invincible arguments that occurred to him only now, in the solitude of the hammock and with his adversary out of reach. Nevertheless, by the nightfall, he felt better, and he gave General Carreño instructions that the government should try to improve the lot of the unfortunate Frenchman. I think that's where we'll stop today, on page 125 in the middle of chapter 4, actually pretty close to the end of chapter 4. Now that we've kind of gotten to the end of that little anecdote about his dispute with the Frenchman. Perfect place to end. So we will pick up next time there, and I hope that you enjoyed today, The General and His Labyrinth. I feel like the street noise was, it was there. It's always going to be there. It's New York, but it was a little less. So that's great news. Enjoy your day wherever you are. I'll see you next time. Bye.